Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, scientists, educators, social scientists, and government leaders. Each will be one to one. I'm delighted of working as a foreign correspondent. Judith felt the need to return to her roots here in New York. She's now contributing editor of the Columbia Journalism Review and teaches at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And her roots are now specifically in West Harlem. She and her husband bought a fixer-upper on a block they shared with drug dealers and longtime residents who deplored what had happened to their community. The story of rehabbing their house is the subject of Homegirl, Building a Dream House on a Lawless Block. It's just been republished by Random House in paperback. Welcome.
Thank you.
Judith, you had a fairly traditional upbringing in Queens, but wandered very far from home. Where did that wanderlust come from?
Well, the neighborhood I lived in, Queens, which was this sort of very modest working class neighborhood, there were about 40 to 80 blocks of identical brick buildings that all looked the same. And as a matter of fact, my mother had to put a gigantic red awning, very brilliant, on the house because I used to walk into other people's houses before I could read. So I think that was the beginning of a desire for something a little bit more exotic. And aside from that, my parents were social workers, so they bred an interest, you know, and I'm from immigrant roots. Already we felt sort of foreign, and I had an interest in other cultures. And it being New York, when I went to school, there were, you know, I had students from Bangladesh and Guatemala and Colombia and Korea and whatnot. These were people I grew up with, so it just sort of nurtured an interest in getting beyond Queens.
So tell me briefly, you know, some of where your journalism career took you.
Well, as soon as I graduated from college, I went straight to Mexico. In those days, this was quite a few years ago, this is in the 80s, Central America was the big story. So I hung around there for a while, then Reuters hired me, sent me to London, then to Western Europe, then I covered the oil market for a while, so I went all over the world. Then they sent me to back to London, to Portugal to cover Portuguese-speaking Africa. Then they sent me to Africa, which point the Christian Science Monitor hired me, and I covered all of Africa for them. Then they sent me to the former Soviet Union. And at that point, I got kind of tired, and I had a midlife crisis. And my midlife crisis was I wanted to get married, have a baby, and buy a house and live near my mother.
And that is what brought you back to New York?
Right. My midlife crisis was not about getting divorced and getting a Porsche. Mine was about getting a life.
Okay. Okay. And what year did you return to the States?
The year 2000, right in time for the millennium.
You talked about in the book about how, you know, traveling around to so many different places in your job, you always felt like an outsider. Did feeling like an outsider, you know, being comfortable with that, was that one of the reasons that influenced your buying this particular house in West Harlem?
Probably unconsciously. I might add, my husband is not American. He's Dutch, and he still had the wanderlust. So for him, going to New York was an unusual place.
Right.
And I speak fluent Spanish, having lived in Latino communities for quite a long period of time. And it was something attractive to me to live in a Latino community. You know, at least we would need to use other languages just to order milk. But the most important thing, when you get down to it, was affordability.
Right.
That we, you know, this is at the dot-com boom years. We didn't have a lot of money saved up as two writers, and yet we wanted a lot of space. We were flexible about where we lived, and West Harlem just sort of seemed perfect. What wasn't perfect was that the extremely affordable house we bought was a crack house. And was a wreck.
Was a wreck. Now, nowhere in the book do you say exactly where the house was. You know, you give some hints. You know, it was a few blocks from City College. It was in walking distance of Yankee Stadium. We went to a restaurant on 146th Street and Broadway, and it leaves the reader to sort of kind of, and I was always trying to piece it together. Where is it? You know, it's somewhere in the 140s between Broadway and Amsterdam. Why didn't you give if not the address, the street, or more precise location?
Well, it was largely for the neighbors. You know, this was a book about a very tight community, and I really was very consultative with my neighbors all along. I didn't want to write a book that was going to upset them. I was going to tell things as they were. And they felt uncomfortable about my actually citing the street. Maybe they thought this book was eventually going to be a bestseller, like A Year in Provence, where tourists would descend upon that man's farm in Provence. That really hasn't happened, but there have been quite a few people wandering around looking for the house in the book. And it was largely for the sake of the neighbors that I thought we should be a little bit coy. You know, give them the general parameters, but not actually cite the book. There was one other consideration, but it was a more minor one, which is that, you know, the drug gangs don't come out too good in this. And although with their own lawyers and they could figure out who I was, we just thought we weren't going to make it too easy for them to know what house to bomb in case they wanted to bomb somebody's house.
Now, this area is what is currently being called, is it Harlem Heights? Is that what they're calling it now?
It's called so many things. Some people call it Vinegar Hill. Some people call it Hamilton Heights. Some people call it Little Dominican. Some people call it Washington Heights, which it's not. It's usually just called, some people call it Manhattanville.
But what's the general, what are the parameters of the area or the neighborhood?
Generally 137 or 133, down to 12th Avenue, up to 155, and over to Amsterdam Avenue.
Okay.
So it's a very thin slip of land. Generally, it's called West Harlem, but it's everybody calls it
interesting,
something
because
else.
that was, West Harlem was a term I had not heard before.
Right. I know. Just like you've heard of East Harlem, you've heard of Central Harlem. Well, now you've got West Harlem.
Right. Okay. How did you find the house, and what made you decide it was right for you?
I had come back from Russia and my husband was behind finishing up our life, and I abruptly said, I'm going to move to New York, hope you can join me. And I took all our money, and he said, honey, find a house. And here I was at age 51, living in my mother's basement in Queens.
Not 51, 41.
41, sorry, 41. Slip there. Not good with numbers. And I just thought, this is really undignified. I really have to get my own place. And I started looking around, and my cousin, who had renovated an old crack house in Bedford-Stuyvesant, we're talking about in the old days, he lived there in the 80s, he was urging me to look at Bed-Stuy. And it was too far from Manhattan for me. The commute was just too far to get to my mother and to work and blah, blah, blah. And then a friend of mine who worked in Harlem, she works at Harlem Hospital, said, why don't you look at Harlem? It's quite reasonably priced. The buildings are in a mess, but you're very handy people. You know, my husband had built bookshelves, so we thought, okay, he can build a house, right? So I looked around, I fell in love with the street life, I fell in love with the big buildings, and most importantly, through the New York Times, I saw an ad for a building that was too cheap to be true. And I rushed over and I looked at it, and they said, if you give me cash on the spot, it's yours. And I pledged every single penny. I couldn't reach my husband on the cell phone back in Moscow. I pledged everything we had on the house. And they said, great, we'll close in 2 weeks, which is unheard of in New York.
Right.
And
unless you pay cash, then maybe you can close in 2 weeks, maybe.
Right, and it was in cash, I was promising.
Right.
And only a week or two later did I find out why it was so cheap.
Which was? It was
occupied by a crack addict who called himself Salami, because it's long and brown, as he will tell you. And the other reason was that there was a drug gang of about 60 guys. It was like a narcotics version of NYMEX. These 60 guys would hang outside, and because our building was pretty much abandoned, our building was their headquarters.
Right.
And they didn't have toilets, so our building became their toilet. It became where they stashed all their stuff. And they were not overly delighted about somebody buying the house.
Right.
And that's chapter 2.
Right, and in addition to the muchachos, you know, the drug people, the house was a mess. You had termites. There's a colony of, you discovered a colony of embedded ants.
Yes.
There was a kitchen wall. I guess it was so rotten that at some point it collapsed. There were a lot of sagging staircase. A lot of work needed to be done.
Right.
Now, you undertook this huge renovation before your husband, before your husband moved over. And
we are still married to this day.
well, hey, and it seemed to be that your work crew, you didn't have a general contractor, and your work crew were people you sort of met on the block or heard about.
Yes.
You know, Raul, an ex-con, Manuel, who's a carpenter, Boris, the painter. Manuel's an ex-con too?
Oh, no, well, he had a dodgy past.
Okay.
Yeah.
Boris, the painter. You had some Bengali, it's a United Nations work crew.
Right.
You had a Mexican plumber, some Sri Lankan plumbers. Now, were any of these workers licensed, or were they all pretty much amateurs?
They told us they were licensed, and we later found out that they weren't.
Okay.
But I hope like the city authorities don't come after me at this point. But we did do legal work on the electricity, which did pass inspection.
Oh, the question I was going to ask, because it's a pretty big renovation job,
right.
And I never heard anything about a construction permit. Were you supposed to have had one?
No, actually, that we had done our research with a friend who was we got a lot of advice from people, unpaid advice, and two architects did advise us that because of the nature of the work, since it was largely cosmetic, except for the electricity, which we did get a permit, the rest of it could be done internally without permits. Thank goodness.
What do you need building permits for then?
Like if you want to move walls, if you want to build an internal or external staircase, if you want to build a terrace, if you want to actually change the footprint and structure of the building and the flow, then you do. But if you're simply changing pipes, you don't need to.
Right.
Thank goodness, because we couldn't afford to.
Describe the renovation process, and did you often want to give up, or did you ever want to give up?
Yes. But the problem is, you see, when you do renovation like this, you demolish everything. So you can't give up, because nobody is going to want to buy a building full of rubble.
Right.
You have to stick with it.
You have to keep going.
And we're pretty stubborn people. My husband's an optimist, and I'm just an ornery, stubborn person.
Okay.
And our attitude was, we were stuck so thick in this, we just had to finish it out of spite to everybody.
Okay.
And we, you know, mind you, we were living in the building while all this was happening, so it wasn't the most pleasant of environments, so there was an incentive to make it better, since we were actually living there. But the other thing is our attitude about life. You know, we used to cover conflict abroad. We've been through some pretty hairy experiences, and our attitude, we approached this the way we approached our work in a place like Rwanda, which was, you've somehow got to see the bright side of things. You've got to see the best of people, and you're just going to get through it. Yeah. And moaning about it isn't really going to help. And if you have a sense of humor, particularly a gallows sense of humor. Most of my gallows humor didn't get in the book because I was afraid it wouldn't be publishable, but it really helped to just, at the end of the day, look at the absurd. And that's part of how that book began, because I kept a very assiduous journal, because I found that if I could write about things in a funny way at the end of the day, they seemed less catastrophic. Right. And that's sort of how the book, the genesis of the book. I kept good notes. And then finally, when the house was in enough of a good shape that we could have people over. Mind you, we didn't have working plumbing, so we would wash the lettuce in the, you know, in the garden, and, you know, we'd serve, you know, we would sit on construction crates. We would tell stories. Right. And, you know, we would try to make the stories sound as funny as possible.
And they said, boy, you've got a book here.
Well, ultimately, a friend was over and promoting her book on Africa, and she invited her publisher over, and he listened very bemused, and at the end of it, he's British. She said, well, surely you've got a publisher. And I said, well, no, actually, I hadn't really thought about it. And he handed me his card, and he said, let's do lunch next week.
Well, there you go.
And that's how it all began.
We're going to take a short break, and I'll be back with more with Judith Matloff after the following messages.
Did you know CUNY leads the way for students with disabilities?
CUNY Leads means linking employment, academics, and disability services. If you're a CUNY student with a visible or invisible disability, the City University of New York offers eligible students free career development and placement services. To find out if you qualify, visit cuny.edu/CUNYLeads. CUNY Leads, to the career I always wanted.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Judith Matloff, author of Homegirl, Building a Dream House on a Lawless Block. Tell me about some of there were a whole lot of characters on this block. Tell me about some of them.
Well, Salami, without doubt, was one of the more present ones in our lives.
He's a crack addict who had been living in your house and was forced out.
He was forced out, not by us, by the real estate agent who sold the house, who had not told us somebody was in the house. And so he then settled into the crack house next to our house. And he constantly, at the beginning, would threaten us and say, I'm going to get your house back. And actually, the working title of the book initially was, It Ain't Your House, Mama, and I'm going to get it back. But that was seen a bit too edgy as a book title. And he used to serenade me. You know that song by The Police, I'll Be Watching You? He used to serenade me with that. He was quite a character. He liked to do chin-ups on the traffic lights. He had been shot a couple times and used to like to show me his scars. When the house was finally ready and we tried to get tenants, he would be there at the door introducing himself as the resident crackologist. But ultimately, we worked out a good working relationship with him. He realized that we weren't nasty people, and he actually took a fondness for us. And by the time I had my child, he would sweep up the glass that was left in front of the house. And I just saw him yesterday. He's very, very friendly, and I introduced him to a friend of mine who was walking down the street, and he informed this person that I was like family to him. So he's actually not a bad man.
There were also people like Mackenzie who spoke Latin, but he was a former drug addict as well, right?
Yeah, Mackenzie was from a fine, good Jamaican family, had been a scholar of sociology in New York and had worked, in LA, and had worked as a paralegal. And it was actually white lawyers in the 80s who led him astray. They used to tip him with coke.
Right.
And he got really hooked into the drugs, but more importantly, he made so much money, he got a bit dodgy with paying taxes on the advice of these lawyers. He was audited and caught, sent to federal prison. This is in the 80s.
Right.
And when he got back, his whole life collapsed. His wife didn't want to see him. His in-laws didn't want him to have anything to do with his children. He couldn't get a job, and he fell apart.
Yeah.
But he was still an incredibly erudite, very gentle man. He drifted, found his way to our street, and we developed a friendship. The first thing he did was he came up to me, said something in Latin, which basically was, I'm going to look out for you. And then he asked if he could borrow books.
Right.
So he would come to our house for coffee in the morning, and we'd make him breakfast, usually something soft because he's losing his teeth. And my mom loves books, so she would come over, and they developed this immense love of books together.
Right.
And they're always swapping books. They have what he calls the coffee klatch. And he's always in the house. And we found him other little odd jobs in the neighborhood, and eventually he cleaned himself up.
And there were also old-timers, like Mr. Anderson, who was, educated, a musician and organist. There was Letitia. I mean, there were middle-class people who were still trying to hold out on the block.
Right. These people I admire beyond belief. They had moved in maybe in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and they were not going to leave. And you have to realize this street had gone downhill. There were riots, the crack epidemic, but they were there. And, first we were wondering, a bunch of whiteys, how are they going to receive us? But they were actually very receptive because they realized that we weren't crack addicts, and we were going to redo up a house, and we were going to be good neighbors. We were going to plant flowers and whatnot. We were going to have a child. That was the big thing. We need more children on the street. And they were lovely. Mr. Phillips always walked around in gloves because he's an organist. Miss Mackenzie, Mrs. LeDuc was my favorite. She was the matriarch of the block. She's now 89.
Victoria LeDuc?
Yeah.
Okay.
She is still strolling every day, inspecting the troops. When I was pregnant, I was supposed to be on bed rest. But I would sneak downstairs to the kitchen, and she can see right into our house, and I would get these phone calls. Young lady, you get right back into bed, or I'm going to call your husband and your doctor. And it's a community. You don't get this in New York that much, but we know our neighbors. At any given time, I can shout out into the street, can somebody keep an eye on the kid, and somebody will come and take the kid. The kids play on the street. The old ladies are on the street. It's lovely.
But there were also the muchachos, this huge amount of drug dealing that was going on openly.
Yes.
in front of the police, in front of everybody.
Yes, that was quite formidable. Before 9/11, the cops used to call this area Ground Zero for narcotics trade because it was the epicenter of narcotics trade for the entire Northeast seacoast. What we found, the best way to deal with these guys was I spoke fluent Spanish, and I'm female, which helps. And I went over them and I said, look, I know you're businessmen. I won't create problems for you if you keep off my property. Please stop using my property as a latrine. Please stop stashing your drugs on my property, and I won't create problems for you. But if you are going to create problems for me, we're going to have hassles. So we developed this deal, which more or less held where they would stay about 5 feet away from the property. If they betrayed our agreement, I would then call the cops. But that was the deal. They would stay away. And we developed a relationship of some sort. It was cordial. I wouldn't say they were my best friends, but when I got pregnant, they helped me carry my bags. When my elderly mother would come from Queens, they would save her a parking space. And then when she scooted out to Fairway to shop, they would keep the space for her.
Now, despite, I mean, you were able to reach a rapport with them, but I mean, all this drug dealing was a problem, you know, for many people on the block. And despite repeated appeals to the 30th Precinct, to Mayor Giuliani, and then Police Commissioner Bernie Kerik, nothing really happened. No. You know, they didn't make a dent in it. And then suddenly, when Michael Bloomberg comes in and Ray Kelly sends in some serious, a serious police presence, and they had a whole lot of press, they were able to wipe it out pretty much.
Absolutely.
You know, so doesn't that suggest, as a lot of people sort of confirm the suspicions that a lot of people had stated, you know, years ago, that Rudy Giuliani didn't particularly care about communities like this one, because he could have done this, he could have gotten rid of the problem if he had wanted to, and he certainly knew that it was a problem. People, you know, were concerned about it, and this was just a community he didn't care about.
You could not have said it better. I mean, it went from day to night, and, you know, Ray Kelly had worked, when he was in Treasury, he had worked very deeply on the issue of drug laundering and Colombian and Dominican gangs. So this was an issue that was close to him, and he had a holistic view of it. And Bloomberg was pragmatic. He wanted the Dominican vote. You know, one of the first things he did when he was campaigning, and also when he was elected, was to go down to the Dominican Republic. You know, I mean, he's a lily-white mayor, but he did realize pragmatically that this underserved community needed to be given better attention.
Right, right.
And I think that one summer, 2002, I think 5,000 people were rounded up.
Wow.
That's a big dent.
What have been the rewards of living on your block?
The community. You know, so many of my friends have a sort of alienated New York life where they go into their apartments and I just feel like I'm in a village. I mean, especially when we had the dog or when the baby was in the stroller and we would walk the street every day. It would take an hour just to go around the street. You know, we really know our neighbors. We have a yearly barbecue where 80, 90 people come. And you know, especially having been a foreign correspondent for so long where I was on the edge of somebody else's society.
Right.
I really feel like this is the way I grew up in Queens, when all the kids played on the blocks and nobody locked their doors. And it's very, very fulfilling. It really is. And I feel like I'm in a real part of New York. I don't feel like I'm in some sterile place where there's a gap on every corner.
Right.
And it's a very diverse neighborhood, and you know, as somebody who comes from immigrant roots, that's very important to me.
How has the gentrification of the neighborhood of Harlem in general affected your block?
We see different new type of people moving in. I would say the richer people who are moving in who could afford million-dollar homes tend to have a different attitude and tolerance to what's around them, which is probably different from our approach. We were more flexible about things. But at the same time, there are more amenities. There's different types of food. You can get different types of stores, and their schools are improving.
Oh, really?
We have two. Up to now, our district was the worst performing district in Manhattan school-wise, and now we have two fairly decent schools. And that makes a very big difference.
We've got 1 minute left. What have you learned about yourself and about your community from having moved to this house, to this block?
I think if I had to learn one thing, it's negotiation. I know it sounds really corny, but much as the Obama approach to communication, harmony, and tolerance, and always talking to people, it makes a huge difference. And as Obama's message always was, yes, you can, you really can turn something around. And we were doing this well before I had ever heard who he was. But when I heard him speak in his campaign, and when I see what he's doing now, it's true, you really, a couple people really can turn something around.
Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank Judith Matloff for joining us. Homegirl, Building a Dream House on a Lawless Block is published by Random House. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.